Hello and welcome to the Paper Prototypes podcast. My name is Rex, and I'm here with Zach. He is the founder of the studio behind Airborne Empire, and that's the game we're going to be talking about today. So, Zach, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and tell me a little bit. All right, so yeah, you had mentioned that you were from Visceral Games. I remember when EA shut down Visceral Games. That was a big deal in the news cycle when I was a lot younger. How many years ago was that again?
That was in 2017.
Oh,
So,
jeez.
gosh, yeah, 8 years ago. It doesn't seem like that long ago, but yeah, it was a while ago.
So, with that in mind, transitioning from a major studio like EA and then going to something like a your own startup, what was that process like?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be honest with you, it was relatively easy in that at EA I was working with a team of over 100 people, located at multiple different studios and all the bureaucracy that comes with EA. And then here it's like, well, it's a much smaller team and there's no like overhead. There's no marketing department telling you what to do or corporate telling you what to do or whatever. And so the sort of number of variables that you have to deal with is just way less. I have a small team. We're not, we don't have like some big company in charge of us. So we just kind of do what we want to do. And so, and then we kind of got lucky in that the first game was successful enough that everything was financially okay. I think if that game hadn't have been successful, we hadn't made money on it, then we're having a much different conversation, right? It's like, well, things got really rough and we had to shut it down, but that we got lucky. So it's been it's been really nice and fairly easy,
Yeah, so
relatively. Sorry.
considering the success you had with Airborne Kingdom and Empire, tell me about what both of those games are like for the audience.
Yeah, they're both flying city builders. So you build a city that flies in the sky. The first game we made was Airborne Kingdom, and the idea was one of the pillars of that game was like mellow, like chill vibes. It's more of just a builder. It's not really difficult. It's just like have fun. It's beautiful. You're gonna build this beautiful flying city and fly around this beautiful world, and it was a fairly straightforward city builder. And while we were making it, I just had this feeling of like, man, wouldn't this be cool if there were like sky pirates, if there was like some kind of like threat? Because like I said, the first game was just about building a city, and that was good for the time. Like it was just a good, it was like the vibe we needed. We had all come from EA. We had, just kind of the time at the, not that it's any better now, but just the sort of political environment in the country. Everybody's like angry at each other, and there's all this feuding, and we just wanted to make like something really mellow and relaxing. And so that was what the first game was. But like I said, while we were making it, I knew there was a little more left on the vine there. Like man, we're not touching combat, and I think bringing some sort of tower defense and then like tactical combat mechanics into this style of game would be really cool. And we kind of thought we were worried, like while we were making Airborne Kingdom, that somebody else was going to make like another flying city builder that had combat. But they didn't. No one touched it. And so we finished this game, and I was like, well, what do we want to do next? And I already knew. I already kind of had Airborne Empire in my head when we finished Airborne Kingdom. So it was a pretty quick transition from one to the other.
How did you initially come up with the idea of wanting to build a city in the sky, as per se?
Yeah, it was a weird path, and I wasn't actually there for all of it. A couple of my friends had left before I did, and so like I mentioned earlier, they already had a prototype uh, when I joined. And so at first they were looking at doing like a hotel simulator, where you're managing a hotel and all the rooms, the guests, and all their needs and wants and things like this. And then like for some reason, I think artistic reasons, we made the hotel fly. And then that kind of opened up the like, oh, like what if we could attach other things to the hotel? And then it quickly became from there a flying city builder.
And how did you, I guess, how did you end up expanding on that initial idea? Because it's one thing to say, okay, we want to have like a flying city, but your game has a lift mechanic, but then if you build too much to one side, the city starts to lean, and then you have a drag mechanic where you need to get more propellers because the heavier the city, the more propulsion you need to generate to maintain speed. So there's a lot
Yeah,
going on with maintaining a flying city, but how did you come up with all those concepts?
I think the first one was lift, right? Like, oh, what's keeping this thing in the air? Okay, cool. It's like some kind of big fan or big engine that's keeping the air. Okay, how do we manage that mechanic? And I think that one was pretty simple. It's like you're providing lift for your city, and then every building that you add has some amount of weight. And so it's like, okay, cool. That's a nice sort of mechanic to just continue to expand the city. And then we realized like as you're placing like additional lift buildings around your city, it makes sense that your city would be being pulled down in certain directions by weight. It would be being pushed up in certain directions by lift. And so we had this idea of like tilt, which is what affects the drag, right? So if you can build a city that's kind of perfectly balanced, then your city will drag less. The workers will be able to walk along the paths smoothly and easily without any risk of, sloped surfaces where they're sliding and falling off or whatever. And so then that became like a really fun, just managing the tilt of the city and letting it get over tilted, and it just kind of looked funny. Like, oh, look at this city in the sky that looks like it's about to turn over on itself. And so it became like this game of just, kind of the initial mechanic was just keeping your city flat, right? Just being able to balance before you could even move the city. We had this idea that you were just building the city, and as you were expanding, it was tilting in different directions, and you were having to constantly add lift and counterweights to manage that tilt. And the tilt drove the happiness of your workers, and then we got the notion of like, hey, we're flying, and so we can move. And I think that if you take away the fiction of it being flying, like it's the really the thing that makes our game unique is the fact that it's a mobile city, that it moves around. Whether it's flying or it's on the ground doesn't matter. It's this idea that rather than you sending out workers to go find resources and then kind of exploiting all the resources nearby and then having to send those workers farther and farther, we have this cool concept where it's like, well, no, your whole city can move to where the resources are, or move to a spot that's near multiple resources. And where is the best spot to sit as far as like quickly gathering all the things you need and looking for spots in the world that had all the things you need in abundance. And then of course from there it was like, oh cool, we really get to focus on building this big open world that the player gets to move around in and find different things. And that was about as far as we went with Airborne Kingdom. And then Airborne Empire, we just had the idea of quests. Like, hey, there's all these quests that you need to do in the game. There's all these people. I'm a big fan of RPGs. I'm a big fan of city builders. And so, like, I was thinking a lot about RPGs when we were making the second one. And I was just kind of thinking about the player's city being their RPG character. And then all these buildings that you're building are kind of, just like if you're playing like a Diablo or it's probably a bad example, but like an Oblivion or a Skyrim or whatever, you have all these like pieces of armor and weapons and rings and amulets that all have abilities. And so like I kind of see our city as that character, and then all the different buildings you can unlock kind of similar to those abilities that you would have in an RPG, right? Like I don't have a sword, but I have a cannon. I don't have a, gauntlets, but I maybe have this building that gives me this special power. I don't have magic rings, but I have these magic artifacts that I can put in these buildings that then give, my other buildings the power of these artifacts. And so just kind of thinking about the RPG aspect of it and how cool and unique that was compared to other games out there right now, right? Like if someone says to you RPG city builder, you generally think about games like Dragon Quest Builders, where it's like you're a character running around in a big world and you're building a city. You don't think about like, oh, the city is the character. The city is like the hero of this thing. And so it just felt like a cool, unique. I think that's the big trick with game development right now is trying to find a spot that you're making something that's not a copy of something else, something that's not already out there.
Did you think that would be a challenge going from Airborne Kingdom to Airborne Empire, considering how very similar in concept they are? That Airborne Empire was going to have enough, not legs to stand on, but I guess balloons to float on?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think the combat was the biggest addition we made. Now, there's a ton of other mechanical changes and art changes and all these things. But if you're just looking at it from a high level, Airborne Kingdom is a flying city builder that's really mellow and doesn't have combat. Airborne Empire is a flying city builder that's more strategic, a little less mellow, and has more combat. And so I think the good thing is that you know we're such a small team. We're a designer, an engineer, and an artist. That's all the full-time people we have. And then we have, we hire contractors to help us out with stuff, but we only have 3 people full-time. And so when you're making your second game, if you can build on the foundation of your first game, then you're just able to make way more game. You know what I mean? And so, we had that foundation from Airborne Kingdom of like, hey, lift and tilt and sort of just being able to attach buildings to each other and then move them around and they stay attached and they fly around and all that stuff. We'd already established a lot of that. And so it was like, kind of getting to do all the things that we didn't get to do on the first game.
And the one of the big changes I saw from Kingdom to Empire is there's a lot of characters. So the world's all populated by anthropomorphic birds that talk to you and give you quests. What was the idea behind that one?
Yeah, I think, in the first game, Airborne Kingdom, we had like some really light narrative stuff. You would go to these cities on the ground and they would give you just a little bit of narrative, but it wasn't delivered by a character. It was just kind of written. And I mentioned I play a lot of RPGs. It's one of my favorite genres, and I think the thing that is compelling about quests is who you're doing these quests for. You need to have like characters that you're interacting with that are interesting, that you'll maybe care about. And so I think we're just trying to bring some of that in there. For me, this game, even though it's a completely different genre, Breath of the Wild is a big influence, like just tonally. And so like we wanted to get like a similar tone to Breath of the Wild, which is like, hey, there's a big problem in this world and you've got to solve it and it's really serious. But also you're going to interact with a lot of characters that are just going about their daily life and they're not, super desperate or anything like that. They're kind of having, like the stakes don't seem super high during all these like individual interactions. Um, and I just wanted to bring in characters. I have a friend that did all our portraits for us, and I had this idea that that these characters are birds. That everybody in this world is birds, but they're not. They don't fly anymore, and like maybe they used to fly like millions of years ago, and they kind of evolved slowly, and like some bird invented a plane. It was like, hey, I don't have to flap my wings anymore. I've got this plane to fly me around. And then it kind of, the fiction from there kind of went like, well, what if it's like Wall-E, where like, I don't know if you've seen the movie Wall-E, but all the people in Wall-E got too reliant on technology, and now they move around in these like, they don't walk anymore. They move around in these mobile chairs, and so it's like kind of a similar thing, like, oh, it's these birds that have like lost their way, and they become more like people. They're lazy. They're walking around. They've got these flying machines, and then just what kind of cool, compelling world building can we do there that would drive to like cool quests and fun quests and interesting, story bits.
And what's drawn you to writing about like there's a really strong theme in both games about rebuilding. In Airborne Kingdom, it was rebuilding the kingdom. Here, it's well, it's still rebuilding a city, but well, yeah.
Yeah, Kingdom was like, hey, there's this like prophecy that the idea with Airborne Kingdom was there was no flying city, but there was these legends that there had used to been a flying city, and the flying city was able to travel all around the world and kind of spread knowledge and spread culture and kind of, and be a really positive impact on the world. And then that had been lost and the world had kind of grown separated. And so you were going to rebuild this legendary city and reconnect this world. And the Airborne Empire story is similar. It's more that, hey, these people are like, these bird people, like culturally, the sky is really important to them. Flight is really important to them. And you're in this world where everybody used to be connected by flight, and then these pirates came and united and kind of took over the skies and shut down the skies. And your job is to kind of like retake the skies so that all the cities on the ground can start sending their planes up again and sending their little blimps and trading with each other and all this. And so as you play through Airborne Empire and you clear out areas, you see more and more like civilian sky traffic. Like all of a sudden, the sky that only used to have pirates in it now has all these like civilian planes flying from city to city, sharing cargo and technology and whatever else. Obviously, I think just if you're making like a city builder and the whole thing is about building a city and expanding that city, then I think the narrative playing into that, like, hey, it's a game about building or rebuilding, just works really well, and it just kind of made sense.
So that does make a lot of sense because I remember revisiting the starting area and I was thinking like, wow, there are a lot more blimps and balloons and planes around here than I remember last time I was
Yeah,
here.
we're still working on like, it's early access now, so I think there's a lot more of that stuff, and then kind of the narrative. It's like having like the narrative loop close where they tell you like, hey, you did a good job, and the skies are free, and we've got people in the sky. Or like, well, obviously we're still expanding on the game, so I think by the time we hit 1.0, that concept of like, hey, look, the skies are getting more populated as you go will be much more clear. Because like you said, right now it's like you kind of go back to your area and you're like, oh, whoa, look at all these planes, but we're not doing a great job of like explaining why. Hey, those planes, those are the result of your hard work. Good job.
So, one challenge when it comes to designing games is always both onboarding new players, but also once you've onboarded them, guiding them to where they're supposed to go. Otherwise, players may end up with like analysis paralysis. And it
Yeah.
seems that you've solved both of those by creating an advisor character. What was the idea behind him?
Yeah, I think that you're right. It's like you drop somebody into this world with all these mechanics, and especially like our game, it's a city builder, but it is also an open world game. Like when the game starts, there's a huge world and you can go anywhere. And so, but if you go to certain places, you're going to die. And so, kind of, we need to give the player guardrails, and we need to be able to talk directly to the player. But what's a way that we can do that where it's not so, breaking the third wall down, right? Like, or the fourth wall, whatever it's called. And so I think that that's just a thing that other city builders have done really well, right? Like if you play like even back to Sim City, it's like there were always like advisors telling you like, hey, this thing is the problem or that thing's the problem. And so it just came kind of naturally. Like we needed a character to kind of walk you through what was going on and to kind of, be your spokesperson when you're interacting with the other characters on the ground and stuff. And so yeah, that advisor character Quill was probably like the first character we had in the game because we just knew before we even talked to the other characters, we need to be able to talk to the player just to explain to them what's going on here and kind of have somebody, motivating them, giving them their quest. Kind of an Obi-Wan character.
So, considering you're sailing around to gather all these resources, how did you end up deciding on resource distribution so that way players aren't in an area where they feel starved and they're just kind of struggling to get by?
It was a lot easier on Airborne Kingdom because Airborne Kingdom, uh, I had made like a bunch of tiles. And then the world, every time you play the game, there's like an algorithm that builds out the world using these tiles. And so what that meant it was I had to have every tile just have a certain number of all the resources because like I didn't know exactly how the game was going to build the map. And so it's like, well, if I make tiles that don't have coal, the game could put four of those together and all of a sudden there's no coal for miles and the player just can't play. And so I basically had a spreadsheet that I knew that like each tile had a minimum and a maximum number of resources. And I tried to balance it out. So I'd say like, hey, there's 20 tiles. Five of these are going to be like wood heavy, five of these are going to be iron heavy. Like I just kind of had like different profiles for the tiles, but they all had something. The trickier one was Airborne Empire because it's not a tile system. It's a hand authored map, and I spent years putting that map together. And honestly, like it was just trial and error. And then luckily, I kind of had some good instincts about resource distribution based on the design that we did for Airborne Kingdom. So I at least had something to look back on to go, okay, I knew that these were kind of the minimums that I needed in certain areas. But of course, we also changed like the burn rate of a lot of resource. Like all the tuning is different in this game, and so like in the end, it just ends up being trial and error. I play the game a lot. I've got on Steam right now. Like before the game came out, I had over 200 hours played, and I'm sure I had more than double that just in the Unity editor, just playing before we even had a Steam build working. And so like as a designer, I think the secret is to play your game and to play your game a lot. And I've worked with a lot of designers that don't. They don't play the game a lot, and I think you're missing something there when you don't. Like the truth isn't just playing the game. You know what I mean? Like you can have all the theories you want, you can have all the design documentation you want, but the truth comes out when you play the game. And so for me, I just try to just play the game as much as I possibly can, and I just have a notepad, and I'm just every time I'm playing the game, I'm writing down, oh, when I was in this area, there was no coal, and it was a really tough spot. And of course, I want to pinch the player in certain areas too, right? I want to have areas where you go and you don't have this resource, and you have to like, be smart about, stocking up on a certain resource before you enter a certain area. But I had to like be able to give visual cues to the player that like, hey, when you go to this area, there's not going to be coal or there's not going to be water or whatever it may be, right? The desert was the easiest one. It's like it's a desert. There's minimal water, and that kind of made sense. And I just had to figure out how to balance that. And that there's no secret for that. I just played it for hundreds of hours.
So, when you complete a game after, and by complete I mean like you finished it, you released it 1.0, do you ever go back to playing it, or are you kind of like, well, that was 300 hours into a game. I don't want to go near that. I'm done with it. I'm burnt out with this concept forever.
Yeah, it depends on the game. So Airborne Kingdom we did 1.0, but then we decided to expand it. Like we added just expansion free downloads afterwards. And some of that just as an indie studio, that's like a really great way to kind of give your game a longer shelf life. So your game comes out at 1.0 and you have like a big release and your sales do really well for the first month. And then the next month is going to be less and less and less and less and so on. And so when you do a big update for your game, you get like a nice bump on Steam. And so just as a business wise, it made sense to like, hey, and there was just more. We felt like, hey, there was more we wanted to do. And so we kept going at it. And so obviously I kept playing that one. When I worked at EA and I would like finish a game, that's interesting. So I worked on a Battlefield game and I played that a ton after it came out. But that's probably the only one I really played. Well, that's not true. Every game that's ever come out, I play it and I get all the achievements. Any game that I make, I always play it when it comes out to get all the achievements. But then I'm usually done.
I don't think there's a game I've completed 100%. Usually I burn out pretty quickly, or there's one that's just a little too difficult, and I go, you know what? Not worth it to me. I'm okay.
Yeah, I would say like it's interesting because obviously when you make the game, it's like you know all the details of the game, and so it's a little easier to 100% the game. You kind of know how it works. And I'm not like a big 100%er. I did 100% Breath of the Wild. Like I did every side quest, I did every shrine, I did everything you could do in that game. But mostly that's not. I'm more of like I play the main line quest and maybe I'll do a few side quests here and there, but I'm usually not that guy. But if it's a game I worked on, I feel like I need to have gotten all those achievements, and I don't know why I feel that way. Like I just do. It's like, yeah, no, I need to. I made that game. Of course, I have to like have beat it.
So, making a survival game, I feel like, can be somewhat easy to intuit, where it's like you gather resources, and that is your mainline progression system. But what are the main pillars to you that make an interesting city builder, especially with the twist that you've put on yours being that the city can move?
Yeah, it's a good question because like I'll tell you the honest truth about city builders is I generally don't finish them. Like I start a game and I build and I get to this point where like I'm satisfied with the city, but I don't have it like a lot of city builders, and I think a good example of not this is Frostpunk. Like Frostpunk had a story, it had like, a goal. And so like there was a thing to shoot for, but a lot of city builders, like when you play Sim City, there's not like an end game really. And so our both our games, Airborne Kingdom and Airborne Empire, have an end game. And to me that was just like it's just a cool twist on the genre. And Frostpunk also, I should call them out because there's an end game there. And I just think that that's a cool. I think that's something that the city builder genre had been missing. Is like this sort of like and I get it. Like some people just want to load up like free play and just build city forever, and that's totally cool. And people do that with Kingdom and Empire for us too, and that's rad. And we see cities that are insanely big, way beyond what you would need to beat the game, and that's awesome. And we're actually adding a bunch of stuff during early access to support that play style as well. But I think this idea that like, hey, you can beat the game is not present in a lot of city builders. And so for us, and I guess that's where we looked at it a little more like an RPG or that kind of game where there are end goals. And I think you mentioned the survival genre, which is I do think a lot of survival games have like end goals, right? And I think that it's interesting when you make a city builder and your city starts moving and your city's flying and you're always like, hey, your city could fall out of the sky if you don't get the resources, then it does become a little bit of a survival game too, right? Like, and I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of like how I was thinking about that stuff.
What was the inspiration to add relics and the minarets in the game? Also, what is a minaret in real life? Or is that just like a concept you invented?
Yeah, so no, it's definitely not. A minaret, I don't want to like misspeak because I think so the first game, a lot of the influence was like Middle Eastern, just the art. And so a minaret, the definition, it's a tall, slender tower, typically part of a mosque. So it's like a religious building. Uh, and it's like there's a balcony, and that's where they kind of and I don't want to speak on other people's religion. I'm not religious, but uh, if you're in like a Muslim country, there's like at certain times there's a call to prayer, and the way I understand it is like there's somebody that goes on the balcony of the minaret and puts out there's like a sound that plays. And I've been to like Dubai and a few other Middle Eastern countries, and I've heard this right where it's like, hey, this is the call to prayer. And so a minaret is a religious building. And in the first game, Airborne Kingdom, we had minarets, and we had this mechanic of just faith. It was like, hey, you need to have these religious buildings, enough sort of minarets to cover all your citizens. And like I mentioned, I'm not really religious, and I felt like it was just kind of the mechanic was just like, hey, have enough seats in church for all your people, and um, I mentioned earlier about the RPG stuff, and one of the things I really like about RPGs is like all the like inventory management of your character. And like, oh, am I going to wear this ring that gives me +2 sneak, or am I going to wear this other ring that gives me, +2 defense, or whatever it might be? These like small little modification choices that you make for a character. And so in the second game in Airborne Empire, the idea with the minaret was like, hey, instead of it just being like this global religion thing, let's make these buildings host relics, and the relics are our equivalent of like rings or amulets from RPGs. They're little objects that have magical abilities, and then the minaret is the building that has to host the object, right? And so it's like if you place the relic in the minaret, then everything in the radius of that minaret gets the power of that magical object, whether it's extra defense or faster reloading or more efficient production or whatever. And then the idea there would be like then players will want to clump buildings around these minarets that have like similar functions, right? So if you have a relic that gives like all your attack buildings a bonus, then you're going to want to have like you want to strategically place this thing as close to as many attack, you want it to touch as many attack buildings as possible. But really the idea from relics came from I didn't like the religion mechanic in the first game, and I just wanted a way to get more like small statistical boosts that the player had to strategically place on their city.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so what was you? There are a lot of buildings that are used for attacking, but the first one that you unlock is the cannon. But the cannon then unlocks the interactability in the map where certain quests require you to use the cannon to discover things, or you use the cannon to directly target enemy buildings. What was the inspiration behind those choices?
Yeah, like so we kind of had there's just a lot. Part of the problem with this game is there's so many mechanics and so many different buildings that do different things. You can't just like hand the player all of that stuff at the beginning. It's just going to be overwhelming, right? And so the first thing we actually introduce is defense towers. And so it's like, hey, before you even get to this point where you're attacking, we're going to just send random pirates to attack you, and you have to like basically play a little tower defense game where you're setting up defense towers to cover your city. And so then the kind of the second element of that would be like, okay, where are these planes coming from? Oh, they're coming from like little outposts on the ground. Okay, well, how can I make them stop coming? They can stop by like destroying the outposts. And so, cool, we're gonna have like this cannon weapon, and that's the first sort of most basic weapon that you can get. And it's a gating weapon, right? It's a lock and key situation. So in the beginning of the game, before you have that cannon, you can't really leave the first area because you don't have a way. You could if you're a really slick player, but like you don't have a way to destroy any of these enemies on the ground, and so all the areas you're going to go to that are covered in enemies, you're not going to have a way to fight them. And so it's just a way to kind of like say, hey, until you're ready, you need to stay in this area, and we're going to because we need to teach you a bunch of stuff, and then when we're ready for you to move on, we give you this key that unlocks the rest of the map, which in this case is the cannon, right? It's like, okay, now you can get down there and do this. And it very similar to like when I'm gonna go back to Breath of the Wild again, but it's the glider from Breath of the Wild, right? Like when you start that game, you're in an opening area and you can't leave because you're up in the sky. And then at one point, when you've kind of done what you need to do, there's a character that gives you a glider, and then you can glide down to the rest of the world, and then you're able to like do everything. And so the cannon is really just our glider. It's our way to kind of gate the player so that you don't run into trouble before you're ready.
Do you think also using equipment or any other kind of system in a lock and key mechanic kind of encourages the player to have more, I guess, well, I'm trying to think what's the word I'm looking for. Like more appreciation for the object that they have.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think it's like something you earn, right? Like, and if you spend time like doing quests to earn a thing, then I think theoretically you're going to appreciate having that thing more, right? It's like I earned this. This wasn't just given to me. Um, but I don't know. I mean, it's a good question, right? For us, it was like a necessity of just the pacing of the game and everything. But yeah, I just think it's like an earned. You earn it, you feel good about it. Like I got this thing, and then of course, like later on, you get more weapons, and then you're kind of making choices. Like, oh, do I want the cannon or do I want the Tesla? You have these different sort of ways to attack. And I think that's really compelling for players too, right? It's like, oh, you beat this game your way, but I found some other way to beat the game, and that creates just kind of cool conversations, right?
You also have a lot of different resources. So let's see, there's wood, coal, iron, glass. I think I'm forgetting something. Then there's water, food, um, and
Cloth,
then
cloth is a good one.
cloth, and then like morale, I guess, is a resource. Um, some areas I would say distinctly have a personality because of a lack of access to that resource. So the desert has a very distinct personality in how you play because of the lack of water, because it's a desert. Was that something that you were like, okay, let's remove a resource and see what the world looks like from there? Or is it just kind of like a trial and error? I picked a biome, removed a resource, and then kind of built off that?
No, I think it was definitely like intended from the very beginning. And honestly, like I ended up putting more resources back in uh, than I wanted to. Just originally, I had no water in the desert except one spot, and then I had, gosh, what did I do? Oh, I had no food in the black spine, the other biome, and it was just a little too tough. It wasn't too hard. You know what it was? It kind of encouraged players to like build the exact same city. It's like, oh, well, now when you go to the desert, you need to build water condensers. Now when you go to the Black Spine, you need to build farms. And I just didn't, it felt like when I was playing through, it's like, well, all my cities are turning out the same because it's like, I have to build this thing to go to this area. And so I ended up bringing back more resources and just making it more scarce, not just like completely gone, right? So there is water in the desert, it's just way more scarce. There's food in the black spine. It's just a little scarce in some spots. And honestly, I think that I will, during early access, try to have more of that. Have more spots where it's like, hey, this resource is really either doesn't exist or is really like there's a minimal amount of it here. We just needed to get an early access out to like let other people play because again, like I'm playing this thing hundreds of hours and then it gets like dangerous where it's like I'm only tuning this game based on the way I play. It's just like we need other people to play, and now we've got that. I've got more people playing the game than I know what to do with, and we pull a bunch of data from how they're playing, and I get people's save files, and I'm able to go look at how they're playing, and I've got a list of hundreds of items of things little small adjustments I want to make that are this kind of thing, that I think just make the game a little more compelling.
So when we were talking about building the city, we had talked about how you were like, okay, if we have lift, then we can tilt it, and that's kind of fun, and then drag is kind of fun. One pillar that I found in city builders is that you have a desire to expand, but the expansion causes problems that you need to fix. So in something
Yeah.
like City Skylines, you build a fuck ton of buildings, but that creates a fuck ton of traffic, which means now you're incentivized to explore the traffic management system because you have too many buildings.
Yeah.
So in a weird way, that is kind of what's happened with your game when it comes to lift. So you have a lot of stuff to lift drops. Okay, now I need to build more lift buildings, or maybe I should build a relic and like restructure my city. Was that one of those things where again it was accidental, or was that something planned from the very beginning?
No, that was planned from the very beginning, and honestly, the thing that we haven't talked about much or at all is speed, like propulsion, right? So like lift is like a pretty simple, like, hey, keep it in the sky. But as your city gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get heavier and heavier and heavier, and you're providing more and more lift, you're also slowing down because of how big you are. And the lift is just like it's honestly kind of a green or red, right? You're either yes, you're good, or no, you're not good. And if you know you're not good, you need to solve that problem within a couple minutes, or your city's going to crash. To me, speed propulsion is much more interesting because you can have a city, a huge city that's going super slow, and that really affects the way you're playing the game. Like you're going into these areas where, hey, there's limited water in this desert, and once I go in there, I'm going to be in there for a while because my city goes so slow. Whereas if you spend some time to solve that problem and make your city go really fast by adding more propellers, more fins, more, wings, more propulsion buildings, then all of a sudden you're this really quick moving city that can go in and raid a resource and load up on it and then really quickly get out of there and move into another area. You're able to like dodge combat better. You're able to like, just move around quicker and be more agile. And so that to me is the one that is similar to what you're talking about with City Skylines and the traffic, where it's like, because what happens there with the traffic is it's not like at one moment you go, oh, traffic, I need to solve this now. It slowly gets worse and worse and worse until you go, you know what, I have to like stop what I'm doing and solve this problem. And I think we have the same thing with speed, where you might not notice it at first. You build a building, you're just 1% slower, and then you're another 1% slower. But hours into the game, you'll realize like, oh man, my city is going at like 20% of its maximum possible speed. Let me like spend some time to solve this, and then when you do solve that and you get it up to like 100%, it vastly changes the way you play the game. Like the game is a completely different game when you're going that quick.
Yeah, I ran into that exact thing. I was going at like 60% like speed because of all the drag I had, and I was like, okay, we're pause combat, pause progression. I've gotten to the safety point. Build as many propellers as I can because I want to go fast, and that's. I think I haven't really taken the time to think about it except during this podcast, but I really like city builders because there is the emergent gameplay factor, which is traffic, but also in this game, it's like, okay, I got my city exactly where I want, and now I'm getting fucked over by raiders. Now I got to build it more defensively, and there's a lot of aspects that you have to plan that kind of give character to your city about like how you want to deal with those emergent threats from your own planning.
Yeah, and the other, when you were talking about all our resources, the one that we didn't mention was workers. Like just having the workers to man all these buildings. Because like when we're squeezing the workers, then you're having to make decisions of like, oh, I could add a propeller, but that costs a worker. And that same worker could be, I don't know, working a farm and helping my food, or, being a resource gatherer, or working on a defense tower. And so, like, every time I get attacked, if I had more defense towers, then I would take less damage. But then I'm using all those workers on those defense towers. And so I'm like, I don't have those workers free to use on propulsion buildings, unless you want to do the game where you're kind of assigning and unassigning workers, which a lot of people do. I don't. For me, it's like I want to have enough workers that I can just have every building fully manned at all times. But that really is a luxury. It's just I like playing that way. When I watch people play on YouTube or Twitch or whatever, I see them shuffling workers around a lot. Like, oh, there's combat. Pull all my workers off the propellers and put them on the defense towers. And they get through the combat and then they switch it back. And that's cool. We'll add more features to kind of support that style of gameplay too. But I just think it's cool that there's sort of these different choices with how you're using your workers. And of course, every worker you add has needs. They need more morale, they need more food, they need more water, they're adding more weight because they need a house. And so then it's like, well, I need to build another lift building. Well, that needs 2 workers. Well, maybe I could find a lift building that uses less workers. And so that kind of motivates you, hopefully, to want to go find all the different blueprints, because all the different lift buildings have different stats, or all the different propulsion buildings have different stats. And so they might use less workers and more coal, or they might use less coal and more workers, or whatever it may be. And so, like, those sort of like strategic choices of how you're using your workforce. Or maybe you're like, hey, I'm going to take a ton of time to just go like get every possible worker so that I don't have to like worry about those choices, And I think that is what makes each game different, right? That you may play a game in your city and your playthrough looks totally different than the way that I played the game.
So, how do you end up finding that balance? Like, how do you end up not ending up in a situation where maybe the workers take up too much food, so the city kind of spirals out of control, or this object doesn't reduces water costs, so now the player like, oh, I just put 2 of these, and now my city never needs water again. Like, how do you figure out the strengths of each building and get it just perfect? I suppose.
Yeah, it's just a lot of playtesting, tuning, and then of course like getting other people to playtest and getting their feedback. And I don't think I have it dialed in perfect yet. I think that some of it is good and some of it, has been and we've made tuning changes already based on early access feedback, right? And so I think it's just that. It's just keep, like accept that the thing isn't done, and accept that like you have to keep working on it based on like new ways of playing that I didn't even think about that people are showing me, which is great. That's the awesome thing. This is my first time doing an early access game. And so it's been really interesting to like get feedback that I can do something about versus like, oh, the game's already out and I'm reading all this feedback. And honestly, it's like demoralizing when you're reading like negative feedback about a game that you're done with. But if I'm reading negative feedback about Airborne Empire, which is in early access right now, it's motivating. I go, oh, cool, these are problems that I can fix.
How do you like decipher what is, I guess, good feedback? Like, have you ever seen someone that was like, yeah, I just never needed to run, I never ran out of food, and you looked at their city and there was just like 50 farms? Or someone that was like, yeah, no, the resource for like this building was just not enough, and it turns out they didn't build any coal storage, and it's like, well, that would have helped you there. Like, how do you figure out which complaints are valid and which ones are just like the player missed a detail or built the city in a weird way that if they had built it in a different way, they would have had a different experience?
Yeah, it's way harder to do when you're playtesting, like early before the games come out, because it's like, what do? We get 10 people to play the game or 20 people to play the game. And it's like you said, someone sends feedback and it's like, well, is this person only, or is this kind of a mainline issue that a lot of people are going to have? And some of that you just kind of have to like, that's where like years of experience doing this come into play, right? Just having like that intuition to know uh, what your goal is and the way they're playing, and it doesn't line up with your goal or not. Because people are always going to play your game in different ways, and that's all fine. It gets way easier when it's early access because now we have tens of thousands of players. So like the truth will come out. Like if something's tuned poorly, it's not one person I'm going to hear about it from. It's thousands of people I'm going to hear about it from. So it's a lot easier to like, it's easy to kind of get feedback from one person and then to debate that feedback, to be defensive as a designer and go, oh no, like you're playing it wrong, you did it wrong. If 10,000 people give me the same piece of feedback, I can't say shit. Like 10,000 people, you know what I mean? Like, so that's it right there, and that's been the best part about this whole thing is like you just get so many people playing your game that you can't you cannot deny the feedback. It comes in. We have like various ways we receive feedback, but one of them is like in the game there's a button you can hit and it's like put in some feedback and that goes into a database. And then we can sort that database. So if I sort that database and I see that like there's 500 complaints about the same thing, that's a legitimate complaint. If I see that there's one complaint about a thing and that one complaint actually contradicts 3,000 other pieces of feedback, like 3,000 people go, I really like this thing, and one person goes, oh, I don't like this thing, then I go, well, guess what? This game isn't like that one person, like this just maybe isn't the game for them. You know what I mean? And that's totally fine too. Like, one of the best parts about being indie is like, I'm making like a niche game here. I'm not making like, at EA, it was always like, how do we make this as mainstream as possible? How do we sell as many copies as possible? Here, it's like I don't really care about that. Obviously, I want to sell copies of my game, but more than that, I just want to make a good game. And if I make a good game, it will have some audience. And if that audience is only, 100,000 or 200,000 people, like that's okay for us. We're a small company. We only have 3 full-time employees. Like we'll be just fine. And so we don't have to worry about like how do we make this thing appeal to like 5 million people, which is great. Like I don't that was a big thing at EA that was really hard to deal with because you're trying to predict what like mainstream taste is, and mainstream taste is constantly changing.
For me, a big reason I don't play as many AAA games as I do like indie games is just because I find a lot of interesting mechanics generate some level of friction. And if you push through, there's a lot of rewards that you can gain from that. But AAA games are very afraid of that, so they'll shave off every little ounce of friction to maintain as many players on board, even if that kind of hurts creating a more unique experience.
No, for sure. And there's like a big, in AAA at EA, we did so much focus testing with exactly that in mind, like trying to identify every friction point and then just kind of get rid of it. And like I don't think as a gamer, I don't think that's the best way to make the most compelling game. I think that you want to have these friction points. And the problem is some players will reach a friction point and they will turn off the game and never turn it on again. And if you're a big AAA company, that's not acceptable. If you're a small indie studio, it's like, okay, like again, we're not trying to make a game for everybody that's like this mediocre, whatever game. We're trying to make a really good niche game. And the players that want to play this game are going to love it, and the players that don't, that's okay. Like there's millions of other games out there.
I don't want to overstretch my opinion, but I'll just leave it at the general audience doesn't necessarily always know what they want. Sometimes they'll complain about something, and then when they play the game, if you look at the drop offs, it's actually very low. So how do you decide when you get feedback that you're not like this? They're just missing the point. I'm going to push the update anyway, and people will like it when they play it more. Versus, okay, this is an overwhelming number of information that I need to accept that I need to change the game for. Like, how do you recognize when maybe it's just this is not for the general audience and you want to make it niche, or if this is just like a bad opinion? Because if you're going based on like a large conglomeration of data,
Yeah.
that kind of means that the way you're tailoring your game is just based on like general audience perception, which from an artistic point doesn't necessarily make it the correct opinion. So how do you
Yep.
strike a balance between knowing that?
Yeah, it just has to resonate with me. That's it. It's like a super simple thing. It's like if I see the feedback, so I'll give you an example. On Airborne Kingdom, we got a lot of feedback that players wanted to be able to unassign workers from buildings. In that game, you can't. You build a building, the workers are on that building. But that's how I designed the game. And so, excuse me. So when I got that feedback, it was like, sorry, but that's just the way the game is, and that hurt us in reviews. You can see it, but in the end, it's like, well, if I don't agree, then I don't agree, and unless someone on the team wants to fight me about it, that's just kind of the way it goes.
Gotcha. That is the worst part about being games being an art is there's no objectively right opinion. You just gotta throw down your flag and hope enough people agree with what your decision was.
Yeah, make a thing that you think is cool, and then hopefully you'll find other people like you that think it's cool.
So the last topic I really want to broach on is, I guess, the general mood that Airborne Kingdom is going for. It's very Airborne Empire. Despite there being combat, it's very light. You know, pirates are causing trade problems. They're not like Fallout level marauders that are raping and pillaging. Everything's very cute and folksy, and it's not that difficult in the way that I was curious. I wanted to test the boundaries of the game, so I just put my ship in the middle of like a pirate base. And yeah, I got fucked up, and I really was struggling to be like, okay, how am I gonna like finish rebuilding while also continuing the fight? But I had to sit there for several minutes before I reached a point where the city itself just collapsed and like the game like reset me. So my question is, what was the general mood that you were going for, and how is the difficulty contributing to that mood?
Yeah, the general mood is like pretty, I think I mentioned earlier, like Breath of the Wild, which is like, hey, the overall story is serious, but like the minute to minute interactions with the story are a little more mellow and light, and that's just because that's the kind of game I like. Probably it's like my age, like the games I grew up playing. I don't know. Um, the difficulty stuff, what I'll say about that is we don't have difficulty settings yet. It's part of early access. We will have them. Actually, next week or this week, we're adding an easy mode, but I'm still working on hard mode. And so while I'm working on the hard mode, knowing we're going to launch into early access with one difficulty, I think I erred a little on the easy side because I felt like, hey, until they can choose an easy mode, I don't want to like really turn away players, especially Airborne Kingdom players, because that game was pretty easy. It's pretty mellow, chill by design. And so I think that as the life of the game goes on, you will see more challenging game modes and more challenging difficulty levels come in there. I just, like I said, I was kind of the only one really playing through the game a bunch, and I just had to make some decisions that were like, hey, at least when we initially launch, I'd rather every time there's a fork in the road, I'm going to choose easy just because there's no escape for the players that just want a city build and it to be mellow if I make this thing too hard. So I think like as we go here, I know as we go here, I will add more challenge once I have this easy mode where it's like, okay, now I have a place for those people to go.
Another thing I noticed was there's no penalty for tearing down buildings. So like if it costs like 5 wood to build a building and I break it, I just get the 5 wood back. What was
No,
the?
that's not
Oh, that's
true. That's only in the case of like maybe the house or something. Most of the buildings, if that you get like some portion of the resource back. So if something costs 10 wood, 5 iron, 5 glass, usually we'll give you back like 6 wood, 2 iron, 2 glass. So you can kind of like it just felt like, hey, you should be able to recycle some of this was just a logical thing, right? It's like, hey, I built all these things. Okay, I want to take it apart. I should be able to get something back out of that. Like, why wouldn't I? Like they're taking, and you can as a designer, you can really get yourself stuck in these loops of like, what would be realistic? I took apart the building. Why would all that wood go away? Like I didn't throw it overboard, right? But I just felt like that made sense to like let the players get some resource back, but they don't get all of it back. And maybe it's tuned a little too easy right now. Maybe I should bring those numbers down a little bit. But that's the idea is you get some of it back.
gotcha. And this is all contributing to the fact that you want players not to immediately fall off because there's no way to change the settings. So it's like almost like an accessibility thing.
Yeah, Yeah, I just think it's yeah, like I said, early access, one difficulty level. Let's make it let's err on the side of easy, and then as we develop the game, we will bring in all the challenge for players that want that challenge. And some of these players have already beat the game, and it's great. It gives them a reason to want to come back and play the game again, right? It's like, hey, we added a bunch of stuff, more enemies, more challenge, more achievements to show that you beat this game at a more challenging level, all those kind of things.
So does that mean the current difficulty that the game is currently in is that like the true difficulty you want the game to be at, or is this just kind of like how you've eased in to onboard as many people as possible?
I think it's probably slightly easier than like what I want the true default difficulty to be at right now. But I think that I'm going to, like I said, this week we will launch, we will add an easy mode, and then that gives me the freedom to start tuning knobs in the normal difficulty mode a little more.
Gotcha. Okay, well, I think that gets through most of my questions, or of almost at an hour. I guess we'll just close off here. Is there anything that you want to shout out while you're here? Like any social media links, promotions for the game? I've had one guest shout out a local pizza place.
No, I think for us, it's just the game, and the game is we're on Steam, and that's it. So it's pretty simple. It's just Airborne Empire on Steam. We have social media. If people want to follow us on social media, that's awesome. You just search Airborne Empire, you will find us. We're the only thing called Airborne Empire. Personally, I'm Zaculon on Twitter. If anybody wants to reach out, I'm always happy to talk. But yeah, or we're on Discord too. If you just search Airborne Empire, I like talking to players, so and I love getting feedback, especially at this point in the game. So if people are playing the game and they're interested and they have feedback, or if they even have just questions, always happy to talk to people.
Well, all right. I'll link that stuff in the description down below. If you're watching this on YouTube or Spotify or Podbean, that's where the show could be watched. You could also follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky, which I will have my link tree down below that you could see. But also in the link tree will be a Ko-Fi. So if you want to donate to keep the channel alive, that'd be great. And I think that covers everything. So until next time, bye.